Welcome everyone to the second in a series of masterclasses from Fortuna Admissions. Starting last week and every Tuesday at whether it's noon on the East Coast or whether it's midnight in Singapore, I'm turning to the expertise of the Fortuna team to look at schools, of course, the business schools that are perhaps your hopes and dreams for the coming years. But we're breaking down each of the elements of the application process. And we do this, of course, in a record year. I've had some conversations with some of the top schools from the US and Europe in the past week or two, and numbers are just off the charts for the admission cycle of 2020-2021. Those are not public figures yet, but I guess they'll share those numbers. It certainly explains why they're all so busy. My name's Matt Symonds. I write about business education, and I feel blessed to be part of the Fortuna team. I also run the Centre Court MBA festivals, which brings many of those top schools to meet with you, the candidates. Why do I feel so fortunate? Well, because working at Fortuna, I get the insight of over 40 former associate deans, directors of admissions, heads of admissions, associate directors from pretty much all of the top schools, US, Europe, and beyond. So something that we've done over the last 10 years is to make that sort of expertise and insight available to all of you, not just through these different webinars, but the ability to reach out and share your story as we look at each of the components that's involved in applying to business school and how your personal background, your achievements, your accomplishments can all be pulled together to put together a really compelling and irresistible application. So for today's session, I'm joined by Heidi Hillis. Heidi is a Stanford GSB MBA and former MBA admissions interviewer. Heidi actually went to Stanford with the admissions director who came up with that iconic Stanford question about what matters most to you and why. It's a great question, Heidi.
It is. It's the one that ties people in knots every year.
Right, and it's something that you've covered in great detail in other Fortuna webinars, on the Fortuna YouTube channel. Similarly with the London Business School, all of the insights that come from Emma Bond, who was the former senior manager of MBA admissions at the school. I said a very busy year at LBS, Emma, and you've seen some great clients that have been putting together their applications in the last few months.
Absolutely. I've had some fantastic clients this year, which are people who are testament to the level of people that are applying to these schools and still going. So round 4 is still ongoing. So we're still busy.
Yes, yeah, and finally they'll all be able to prepare their suitcases, get off at Baker Street and head to start a new chapter of their lives. We're also joined by Brittany Michelle. Brittany was a former member of the admissions team at Wharton, but also brings her expertise of grad school and undergrad through her time at Princeton and at Johns Hopkins. Brittany, again, I mean, Emma was saying how busy it's been for the UK schools, but the US, Wharton, Sloan, the M7, a very busy year for you.
Yeah, it has been. I'm interested to hear those numbers that you referenced.
Right.
But very, very competitive year, and possibly will roll into next year too. So
right,
interesting to see.
Yeah. Now, of course, embedded in all of that, what people have been putting together, last week's masterclass, we looked at the sort of strategic positioning of, with your profile, with your background, how do you stand out, whether consulting, banking, software engineer, and the sort of reflection that really needs to go into these applications. So there's a great session that all of you can check out that we recorded with Caroline, the former admissions director at INSEAD, Carla, an associate director at HBS, and Julia, who was the managing director at Kellogg. Next week, after we'll be focusing on the essays and sharing that story. So do join us next Tuesday at the same time. But today, this session is all about 2 key components. We'll be looking at letters of recommendation and then your resume. And it's not the resume you may have used to get your first job. This is the resume that you've really finely tuned to apply to business school. But there are 2 critical voices that are involved in your applications. And the fact that we're having this session, I think, in late April is great, because anybody that's looking at those round 1 deadlines, maybe not the round 4 deadlines Emma was mentioning, but certainly as you plan for September, thinking about the right people, reaching out to them and working with them over the coming months. So Brittany, I'm going to turn to you to get us started in terms of the choice of recommenders. Who should we have in mind?
Absolutely. So choosing recommenders is really important, and most top schools give some pretty clear feedback on who you should be considering when you're thinking about recommenders. So preferably you want to have someone who has supervised your work, so someone from your professional career. That's for your first choice recommender. Your second recommender could also be someone that was in a supervisor capacity, but it might be someone from outside of your current role as well. It could be a client that you worked with. It could even be someone from an extracurricular. So I've actually had a few candidates recently whose career goals are really blending their professional life and something that they've done from an extracurricular. So in that sense, it can be really nice to have, that different voice come in. Even mentors, and again, someone from maybe a community group could be a great choice.
Right, because presumably, let's imagine someone who's applying to business school and they've worked in the same company since coming out of undergrad. The temptation maybe to get two people from the same company, but what you're suggesting is if you've already locked in that first supervisor, that close substantive relationship, maybe that gives you more freedom and perhaps a distinct voice and not someone that will simply overlap and essentially say the same things.
Yeah, it's important to have some differentiation in your letters because there's more than usually one or two or three things that someone can say about you. And so often when we're thinking about recommendation strategy, we'll maybe even I'll go through 3 or 4 or 5, different options and really try to think about who might be able to highlight what, about your candidacy. And try to think about, try to take that step back and kind of look down on the whole application even to understand who might be best positioned to help you tell your story.
Right. Now, of course, Emma, you were sharing as we were getting started, the temptation, of course, to bring in the big name. In your case, someone that could have reached out to Tony Blair. We've had Justin Trudeau. We've had, CEOs of the Fortune 500. Well-known figures in the corner office, but that may not be the best plan.
No, absolutely. And I think the thing to remember is that in order to create an effective recommendation, you are going to need recommenders who can supply concrete examples. So not someone that can just give a list of what you've done, but because the AdCom will be able to get a sense of that through the data form, through your CV. They don't really need that repeated by the recommender. And it comes back, I guess, to the purpose of the recommendation. So what is it doing for you in terms of your wider application, and what does it tell the admissions committee about you? So what you want is someone who can speak well about your transferable skills and the sort of core capabilities, I guess, that the MBA programs are looking for. So rather than just saying, X has done this, it would be, well, in doing this, they have utilized those sort of core capabilities in terms of problem solving, in terms of decision making, communication skills, how you've demonstrated your negotiating abilities, whatever it is. And then in addition, things like sort of leadership, so whether you've been effective in leading teams or in leading projects. And then I guess the other thing is also that you want somebody who understands what motivates you. So not somebody that can just talk about sort of the nitty gritty, the day to day, but understands what's driving you towards seeking an MBA in the first place. And also perhaps your career goals in terms of where you want to go when you finish the program.
Now, Heidi, we'll be talking about the resume and how each of these components plays a role. But it is the opportunity for a recommender to really give a deeper sense of certain strengths, certain characteristics that go beyond those bullet points that Emma was mentioning on a resume.
Yeah, I mean, the schools are really looking for your leadership potential. And so they'll be evaluating you on that throughout your application, but these recommendations are really the main places where they're going to be looking for another person's point of view. And so what your recommenders can do is not only talk about how they see you, but also they can give examples, as Emma said, and go into some details about how others see you, how others respond to you, how the room is different when you walk into it, how a project might have gone a different way if you had not been involved. So they really want to see your recommenders kind of comparing you to your peers and also to what's expected of you in your role. So they will be looking for, they do ask you in the recommendation, they ask all recommenders to rate you on a grid often of different leadership qualities. And so they'll be looking for kind of examples of how you've shown that style of leadership throughout your engagement with them.
Right, and the rules are rules. I mean, they ask for 2 recommendations, so the schools aren't turning this into a popularity contest of, oh, well, there's a third person that really likes me. I mean, are there any legitimate ways to get an additional voice in there, or it really is sort of respecting the recommendations they're asking for?
I think it's really respecting what they're asking for. They're not looking for more than that. And in fact, some schools ask for only 1. MIT only asks for 1. And so they really do want to be kind of in the two people who are recommending you, and within the form that they're actually asking for. So sometimes there is that temptation for recommenders to want to write a long kind of letter, but that's really not helpful for you or for the adcoms, because they want to see, you know, side by side different candidates and all in the same format.
Right. Now, just to my viewers, I tend, if you followed any of our webinars, I get so intent on what my fellow panelists are saying that I sometimes lose the thread with questions, but it's great to see that many of you are already writing in your questions, and we'll try to handle them as we go through the webinar. One great question is in terms of perhaps either not who to ask, or just the idea that the company that they work at is not keen on you heading off to do your MBA. In fact, we see this a lot from law firms, as well as those, you know, anxious about how it might affect their end of year bonus. Emma, any thoughts in terms of, you know, it's very delicate to ask my boss at this point. Is that something that the schools understand?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've actually faced this year. I've had a few clients from law firms who are looking to an MBA, and we've had this discussion. You know, depending on what your circumstances is, sometimes you can use a previous employer. That's one of the circumstances when that would be considered acceptable to do that. Sometimes, depending on who you work for, you can use a client. If you are an entrepreneur, you can use perhaps a co-founder or somebody that, again, it's somebody that can speak to your capabilities in the working environment at a detailed level. So most schools are pretty understanding, and a lot of schools will also ask you on your application form whether or not your employer is aware that you're applying to grad school. So it's usually a way around it.
Right. And with the fantastic diverse mix of applicants, Brittany, that apply to the top schools, we have one of our viewers who's just started his first position right out of a PhD and thinking about applying to programs. So in that case, you know, we've talked about typically within the restraints of a professional recommender. But in that case, could they ask their PhD supervisor, do you think?
Yeah, I think in that case they could. There's always ways to work around what you're working with, I think, in this process. And schools are really open to hearing, you know, why you've made the choices that you've made. So I think as long as the person can speak to, you know, there's sort of canned questions that many schools ask recommenders to write on. So as long as the person can speak to those, you know, really thoughtfully and meaningfully, you'll have some flexibility with who you ask.
And Heidi, how far back can we go? So one of our viewers is asking, you know, that there is potentially a great recommender, but it's from 4 or 5 years ago. The school wants to get a sense of where you are today as well.
Yeah, I think that it's a balance. I think that if you are going to use one recommender that goes quite far back, that is possible. Again, it's thinking about what are the opportunities that you've had to show leadership. And so if that was some organization that you ran, you know, a few years ago, or even in college, that can be really helpful, as long as I think you need to balance it with someone more recent as well. I mean, because someone from so far back might not be able to really speak to kind of how you progressed. And so it's nice to have those 2 points of view. I think, again, it gets back to those leadership qualities and really understanding who's the best person to really speak for those. And so I do think it's okay to look broadly at different points in your life, different jobs. But if you are going to use someone from quite a long time ago, I would probably encourage them to look for someone also recent.
Right. And just one final question, Heidi, which I guess is specific to the GSB, that encourages for one of those recommenders to be a peer. One of the viewers is saying, you know, does the age of the recommender count just in terms of their credibility?
Well, the GSB has actually changed that guidance in the last couple of years. So they now actually ask for 2 recommenders who've seen you in a supervisory capacity. So not the peer as much anymore, although you can kind of get around that. The age does not matter, I don't think. I think, you know, that does, much more important is someone who knows you well and who can speak well to what they've seen, how you've interacted with your peers, how you've interacted with your superiors, how you've shown those qualities, again, the leadership qualities that they're looking for. So I don't think age or title is really that important. It depends a little bit maybe per school. Some schools are maybe a little bit different on that than others. Certainly for Stanford, they're not looking at title. They're not looking at age. They're looking for someone who really knows you and someone who's really in your corner.
One of our viewers has very nicely asked a question that leads us into the next area of letters of recommendation, and that's looking at, you know, how to work with recommenders and helping your recommenders to help you. So I'll get the right screen up. That's this one. And Brittany, perhaps, you know, your thoughts on what is sort of an ongoing relationship. We talked about it being late April and using the coming months to really sit down and work closely with your recommender.
Yeah, so it's really important to, even though your recommenders are hopefully going to be people that know you really well, to still be active in, you know, setting them up for success in this process. And so one of the first things that, you know, we coach applicants to do is to be really clear about their career goals. And sort of Emma mentioned this before. Make sure the recommender knows why you want to go to business school. The next thing that I think is really important is to just walk them through not only the process of a business school letter of recommendation, which is a little different than other graduate programs, but fill them in on why the recommendation is so important, you know, what role the recommendation plays in the overall application process. Unlike other grad programs, there are some canned questions that schools ask, and it's always a good idea to make sure your writers know what these questions are, that it isn't just this big open-ended letter, you know, that could be 5 pages long and they can, you know, say all the things that they want to say. Heidi mentioned this, they really want to know about your performance, right, and your potential. And there's even a question about how you take feedback and sort of work through feedback. Some schools add questions, some short questions. There's a couple that are about diversity. So it's really important that you know and that you communicate with your writers, you know, if they're going to be extra questions outside of the 2 pretty standard ones.
And just to give them a sense maybe of the workload involved, and the schools have been in an ongoing dialogue, you know, recognizing busy people writing 5, 6, 7, you know, completely different letters of recommendation would be a tremendous workload, but we're nevertheless trying to capture perhaps certain characteristics specific to a school, whether it's, you know, collaboration at Kellogg, it's some of those sort of analytical skills that Wharton and other schools are looking for. So you're nevertheless trying to personalize each of these letters of recommendation to the schools you're applying to.
Sorry, was that yeah, no, I was just thinking about sort of the idea of personalizing to the school, because obviously there are a raft of different recommendation questions, and Brittany mentioned the one about feedback. There are also questions that ask you to ask your recommenders to rate you against your peers. So I'm specifically thinking of one in the LBS recommendation here, which sort of says, you know, against your peer group, how do you rank? How do you perform? And that can be quite a useful time to go back to your recommenders, and when you're sort of walking them through the process at the beginning, to go back to your feedback, any 360s that you've done, your peer review, anything like that, and actually prep your recommender so that they have front of mind, you know, the areas where you have made progress, the areas where you have perhaps taken constructive feedback well and then implemented it successfully. And we talked a little bit before about the sort of need for examples, and I think it's really critical to sit down with your recommenders and work through so that they have the examples to hand. Don't make them work too hard. It's a really in-depth process to go through, and anything that you can do in terms of highlighting actual examples where you demonstrated the things that you would like them to identify will be really helpful.
I guess embedded in that, Emma, is just the idea of, these are people potentially supervising many analysts or associates or software engineers level 1, 2, 3, and how you can just sort of put back in front of them some of the different projects that you were so heavily involved in and the accomplishments perhaps that came with them.
Definitely, and I think in line with that, it's important to remember the idea that they should show the result. So it's rather than just sort of talking about a project that you were involved in, what was the outcome? How did it affect the business bottom line? If that's relevant, how did it impact your team, if that's relevant? So it depends, it obviously depends on the example, but it's really good to show a result where you utilized a skill within a concrete example and then it created a positive impact for the business or for your peers or for your reports. And the other thing is just timing, making sure that your recommenders know when the deadline is and giving them an internal deadline. And that's one of the things we tend to do with our clients is get them started on their recommenders first, because it's no good having everything else ready and then sort of not having your recommenders ready to go when you need them to be. So that can be just recognizing that they're busy, and it's a good idea to give them a heads up as to when you would like the recommendation ready.
Right. Well, I mean, Emma's idea, Heidi, of starting with recommenders. If we take the example of Harvard that says we read the letters of recommendation, so the essay "What More We Should Know About You," or Stanford's essay we mentioned earlier about what matters most to you and why. Those are explicit invitations from 2 business schools to, I think, tell a far more personal story. So presumably with recommenders, it's also then sort of identified, well, this is fantastic. They're able to capture this aspect of my professional performance to give me that freedom to share that more personal narrative.
Yeah, that's why I think in terms of process, I think that, when we work with clients, we tend to work on the recommendations first. And I think that's a really helpful process. First of all, it goes through that process of helping you identify, first of all, for yourself, those leadership qualities that you feel that you have, help to prepare your recommenders with those stories that Emma was talking about, sitting down with them and getting into the details. The devil really is in the details, because the only way that the admissions committee really has to be able to compare candidates is through detailed stories. You can say, so-and-so is a great analyst and does great modeling, but at the same time, what does that actually mean? It means, how can you compare that to someone else? How do you compare against your peers and also against the people who are applying? So I like to do that first with the applicants to just help them really get an idea of what they have. Doing the letter of recommendation and the resume before you even start on the essays, I think is a really good rule of thumb, just because then you've ticked all those boxes, what they're going to see in terms of your accomplishments, and it helps you to get really personal and to another level of depth in the essays, because that you've covered those. You don't have to explain them, hopefully, or maybe you do. Maybe that's what you do in the essays themselves of why you've made certain choices. That's leaves that for the essay portion of the application.
Right, and Brittany, your thoughts, how conversant do they need to be with business school? I mean, the idea, of course, they went to Wharton, they went to INSEAD, they went to Berkeley. That's not essential, because of what you're saying about what really is the focus is about you and how you've worked and your achievements, rather than always tying it to their background and having been to business school themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I've actually seen in letters written by writers who have been gone to an MBA program is they might talk even too much about their own experience sort of in the beginning of the letter, and the letter is not about them and what they think about business school. It's about the candidate's performance and potential and what they do, their impact, their leadership, and the other things that the person is deciding to highlight. So it's absolutely not necessary to choose someone just because they have an MBA.
Right. I'm reminded with one of the questions that we've just had of a former colleague who's now at one of the top business schools, in this case at HBS, would they be a good choice? I mentioned earlier how lucky I am to work with so many insiders and their close relationships with the schools. Harvard has said, just stop having people reaching out to the admissions office. They're absolutely overwhelmed, not just with letters of recommendation, but those are part of the application. But if I get 11 Harvard students or recent graduates to vouch for me. It can actually be counterproductive, I think, at this point. Well, one question perhaps for Emma, 65 nationalities at a school like London Business School, Emma. So a recommender who, a couple of things, maybe English is not their mother tongue, but also, if you ask a Finn to write a letter of recommendation, the Finns are known for being fairly curt and to the point. There's no small talk. They certainly don't use the sort of exuberant language you might get from an American recommender. Does a school like LBS, understand the cultural context of where a recommender might be coming from?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. They definitely do. I think, they are, for starters, they have a very international admissions team, so they have a good understanding of different cultural contexts. So yes, I guess the first answer to your question is they will understand that, and they do understand the different nuances that come with different types of recommenders from different nationalities, and I guess also across different industries. So somebody that's writing a recommendation from within a law firm may write, in a different way than somebody who's within a big marketing firm. But I guess the other thing is that it is worth sitting down with your recommenders and really explaining to them how important these recommendations are, because sometimes I think with my clients, recommenders just think, that it is just a case of sort of just a letter as if you would write if someone was going for a job. So you can just be quite superficial. And as Heidi said, the devil is in the detail. But it's up to you really to explain to your recommender how important these recommendations are and what a value add a really strong recommendation can be to your wider application.
Right. Heidi, you'd emphasise the importance of sort of checking in with your recommenders, not just to make sure that they know the dates that they're supposed to be submitting these recommendations, but giving them plenty of time, that you're available in an ongoing dialogue with them. And quite possibly, we see this a lot at Fortuna. You start maybe with the idea of applying to a couple of schools, and then it expands. So it's also with their sort of support and encouragement, you might be going back to them to then approach them for a third, fourth or fifth school.
Yeah, it is. I think it's really, that part of the process is really tricky. I think it's important when you go into the process, or when you first approach your recommenders, that you give them the right expectations of, first of all, how many schools you're going to be applying to, and really realistically how much time it's going to take for them. I don't know if Brittany and Emma, you have a good rule of thumb, but I mean, beyond, there's the work on the essays, or the written part, which in the US, fortunately for most schools, is similar. There are some outliers. So if you have any of those outliers, it's really important to know that and to prepare your recommenders to have those answer those questions differently. Then they have to do the online form itself, which is to upload the questions, go through the grid, answer a bunch of questions. So I would say, realistically, it takes them anywhere from 1 to 2 hours per school at the time of applying. So it's really important to make sure that, as Emma said, that they have those deadlines. They know what's expected of them. They know how many schools that you're applying to. I think, people have asked, is it okay to have have the same recommenders apply to, say, 6 schools? And I think that, again, if the questions are relatively similar, that's probably okay. You do need to be, obviously, it's your relationship with your recommender to see, how busy are they? How much of a big lift is this for them to be cognizant of their other, duties. And so what they need to actually know exactly what's expected of them. And I'd say, so giving them plenty of time, I would say a good rule of thumb is about a month before the deadlines. I always tell my clients to give them a deadline that's at least a week before the actual deadline, so that we have a little bit of leeway there. I actually had a client last year who he was applying to 6 schools, and we did all this preparation for his recommender, and in the end the recommender was late. And it's just heartbreaking, because that is, after all the work. And I think that when you get to the end of the process, it is a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and to have that be the thing that doesn't get in on time is really, really unfortunate, both for you and for your recommender, your relationship with your recommender. It's just not a great situation. So checking in, making sure that they're on track. And if you have someone who you think it's maybe a little bit iffy, having a backup plan.
Right. Yeah. I mean, just the idea that it is the wrong person, or they're not quite as enthusiastic and supportive as you have. I mean, Brittany, have you witnessed, with applicants, your clients that apply to the M7 schools, that there's sort of a level of recommender fatigue, and that perhaps when you are applying to multiple schools, bringing in perhaps a third or a fourth voice just to mix things up a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I also, building on what Heidi said, always have a backup, always have a backup there, even if not because the recommender might say drop out or you might want to switch, but even if that fatigue happens, especially when you're getting in that 4, 5, 6 plus range. We also work with applicants who might have a set of schools for round one and then change their strategy or add schools depending on their results from round one. And sometimes in that case, depending on what's going on at work and just what's going on in the lives of your recommenders, we may bring in that alternate. So it's good to have a couple different people out there ready to go.
Right. And I suppose that speaks to a scenario where someone has only recently joined a company and would have only been there for 3 months, perhaps by the time of round one, which doesn't give a recommender a lot of time, for the sort of depth of insights we're looking for. But round two, you'd have been there then for 6, 7 months, and that could make the difference, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, Heidi, you're going to add?
Oh, I was just going to say that for the if you do push to round two, it is also really important for the recommendation strategy to recognize that the recommendations or the applications are due the beginning of January. So really, making sure that you have factored in the holidays and trying to get not having your recommenders having to work over Christmas is important.
Right. Now, I have to say, whenever we do a webinar and we have a slide with a title like this, what the typical mistakes, because all of you with your backgrounds working in admissions at Wharton, at London Business School, everything that you know about the GSB, you must see some fun stuff. So who should we start with the typical mistakes? Heidi, you've seen them. What should we be avoiding?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, it gets back to the details. I think that the biggest mistake that most recommenders make is just too generic of a recommendation. Something that says like, so-and-so is a real team player and leaves it at that. You really want them to follow up with an example of that supports that statement. So instead of just they're a team player, something like, so-and-so is such a team player. On this one occasion, we were working for a client really late, but we had to do this model and it was not working well. This person was supervising an analyst, but instead of just doing it themselves, they sat down with the analyst, went through the entire model, built it from scratch, and in the process, trained this analyst on how to build a good model. So it just kind of gives you that flavor of what you mean, what the recommender means by what a team player is. So that's, again, getting back to really working with your recommenders and saying, these are the types of qualities that I'm trying to emphasize in my application. Here's some stories. Let's think of some stories together. Here are some of the feedback that I've had in different feedback sessions with you. Can we elaborate on those, and really helping them to get to that level of detail?
Great. So Heidi started with that example simply being too generic. Brittany, can you be too euphoric?
Yes. Yes, you can. It is a red flag to read a letter that is just too over the top. It's just, the language is too flowery. It's too good. One mistake that I see that I find to be pretty, I don't know, makes me mad when I see this is when recommenders do not actually approach a candidate's weaknesses, where they only talk about strengths. I think there's the authenticity sometimes of those types of letters can come into question, especially in the feedback question that many schools ask. Having a writer who talks about sort of a strength within a weakness and not just focusing solely on something that you can get better at is something that is typically a mistake. And so it's okay to not be perfect in this process. It's good to have some level of vulnerability and for there to be some growth trajectory sort of within the application. And this is a really good place for that to come out. So I often talk to applicants about, making sure their writers know that they don't need to present, this over the top image of you, that they can be genuine, and that, you know, having things that you've needed to work on is actually a good thing and adds to the authenticity of the application.
I can just picture with Judith and Michelle and other colleagues at Wharton sort of raising eyebrows at this, you know, recommend that doesn't stop glowing. And I suppose, you know, speaking to that point, Brittany, it also gives the opportunity to say, you know, this was really tough. This was a real challenge. It could have been in the last year with the pandemic and, you know, conditions of remote working. But look how the candidate got through that challenge, right? So it's not all rolling out a red carpet and everything was great. It's being able to show how a candidate has been on a journey, I guess.
Yeah, we talk about that in the context of a lot of the components of the application. And again, it helps with authenticity. A lot of our candidates appear very, you know, superhuman on the resume. They've done, you know, amazing things. Their education backgrounds are, you know, flawless, but this is a human process. And, you know, schools are admitting real people with real stories, and that are, many of them, imperfect in some ways. And I think really taking ownership of that in the places where you can in the application, that's something that stands out to me as a quality that I want in someone that I'm going to admit, and that I want to be, you know, my classmate, and that I want to be, you know, an alumni next to. So I think that, yeah, it's important to sort of own your flaws if you have them.
Right. Emma, of course, this is the point when you're supposed to admit to a large public audience that with that Disney subscription that you've had, you've watched all of the Marvel superhero movies and WandaVision. But superheroes or just being too much, you could, recommenders can also then be perhaps too technical or sort of get lost in professional jargon.
They can, and I think it's a case of trying to find the middle ground if you are writing one of these recommendations. And so when you sit down and talk to a recommender, you have to make them understand who the audience is going to be. So you need to make sure that within the material that's provided in the recommendation, there is a sort of context, so that they frame your role within the business. There's a sort of general understanding. I guess most people on an admissions team who are reading, don't forget, you know, hundreds, thousands of these applications, do over time gain an extraordinary understanding, actually, in terms of breadth of sectors and everything. But it is still not somebody from within your industry who is going to be reading the recommendation. So it's not like a recommendation that's going off to an actual firm. It's a much sort of wider perspective. So it's a case of going back to that idea of storytelling and giving these examples and trying to frame them within the business and within the role and within the sort of the context of the organization, to show what it is that has made you exceptional and what it is that has made what you have done stand out in your peer group. And whether that's you know, talking about sort of the leadership aspects that Heidi was mentioning earlier on, and showcasing how you've done that in terms of mentoring, in addition to your sort of day-to-day role, or whatever. It's just really kind of making it accessible, I guess, to the reader and to the audience that it's designed for. And I think I always come back to that point of, don't make the admissions team have to work too hard. So going through too much technical jargon and everything is just, if you've been reading a lot of these things, it's probably the last thing you want to do at the end of the day. So yeah, just that's something to be careful of, definitely.
Now, with all of those years of experience at London Business School, did you ever have a sort of a jaw-dropping moment of, I can't believe the recommenders just said this, or that perhaps the applicant chose to ask this person?
I think there are probably a number of those occasions, to be completely honest. I think my pet hate, to be honest, with recommendations goes back a bit to what Brittany was saying about not being honest about weaknesses, because if a recommender is identifying a weakness and it is then addressed in a proper way within a review, for example, it's actually real progress to show that the person has then been able to implement improvements, and that the next time this situation came up, they approached it differently and they put in their learnings and they used the feedback that was given and the constructive criticism in the manner which was meant. So I think recommenders who leave that part out are actually doing a disservice to their candidate.
Right. Heidi, just one final question from you that's come in from the audience, and it's a common scenario where that busy recommender, you know that the right person to ask in terms of, you know, the close substantive working relationship you have, but they've said, listen, you know, why don't you draft? Why don't you write letters of recommendation and I'll sign them? It's not only is it very difficult to then have a distinct voice that doesn't sound like your own from the essays, but how do you recommend that applicants navigate that sort of situation?
Yeah, it's a really difficult situation, and I do really advise people to try to avoid that, because as much as you think that you can write a good recommendation for yourself, you know, I've seen how people do it and they're never as good as the person, the recommender. I just think that there's, you know, it's easy for you to kind of say, you know, it's probably easier for your recommender to say, so-and-so is the best at this thing, whatever that is that I've seen, as opposed to you saying it. It really puts you in a very difficult position to try to kind of craft your own recommendation. So in those cases, what I try to do with clients is to, again, sit down, look through those examples, maybe write up some of those examples and pass them to the recommender to have them kind of have some ideas of what they might write, spark those thoughts for the recommender so that they can write it themselves, and really try to get the recommender. And again, it's, you know, if they're not really willing to write it, maybe it's not the right person. So you might need to rethink your strategy.
Right. Now, there may be one or two. We've got through quite a few of the questions that you've been submitting, and do keep sending in your questions. Any that we miss, we'll try and follow up by email, or perhaps, you know, in those conversations that we'll have, reaching out to us just to have a free consultation and talk about your situation, who you're thinking about for recommenders. But we're going to make a switch now to looking at the resume, the CV. And also, as we go through this session, the panelists have put together sort of before and after situations of, you know, different ways to highlight aspects of your professional and personal narratives. So I'm going to start with Emma, as we, you know, this idea of lots of consultants, lots of bankers, lots of engineers applying to business school, and really making sure that your resume stands out.
Yeah, and it's I think the first thing to remember is that your MBA resume is different from a resume for a sort of standard job application. So it's one part of a whole, and a very detailed whole application. So an application that will, you know, include detailed recommendations, often a number of essays, or, you know, something like the GSB's very open essay. And, you know, then obviously the data form. So it's usually one page, and sometimes people have real trouble sort of condensing down, especially if you're looking at perhaps EMBA clients or MBA clients who have a little bit more experience. By the time you sort of try to fit everything on, and you want to make sure that it stands out and you've got all those examples, sometimes, you know, that's something that clients really struggle with. But it does for most MBA programs, certainly all the ones that I am aware of, it's usually one page. It's read by a real person, so an admissions person. It's going to be sort of scrutinized, but it has to give a snapshot. It's not going to be something that's poured over with huge great detail, because it is part of this much bigger application. So it just wants to cover the sort of very key parts of your professional development, but it really sets the tone for the rest of the application. So it's really important, obviously, to do your due diligence in terms of just making sure it's professional, and that suggests that the rest of your application is going to be as impactful as that first sort of glance at your professional and educational background.
Now, increasingly in sort of the job market, you mentioned it's being read by a real person, because, you know, there are, as softwares will sort of scrape the different technical skills that you have, keywords that they're looking for to make a match with the job positions that they have. And you emphasize, you know, this is real people that are taking the time to go through each of those bullet points and the chronology of education, professional, and then the fun stuff down at the bottom about, you know, the passions and hobbies that you have?
So some candidates forget that the extracurricular section, even the education section of the resume is actually really important to admissions officers. So, you know, when I'm first looking at a resume, I am looking for your career trajectory, you know, achievements in your career, but I'm also looking to the ways that you'll add value to, you know, to my program outside of, you know, what you've done professionally. And so in the education section, for example, I might be looking for, you know, clubs or leadership that you've, you know, taken part in during university. If you've gone to a graduate program, I might be wondering, you know, how does that sort of fit in to the MBA picture? And then as far as your other extracurriculars, I really like to see applicants, you know, community engagement, because when I'm thinking about, you know, where you are going to add value, you know, in my program, I know that a lot of that value is going to be added outside of the classroom. And so a red flag for me is if I get a resume and there's no extracurricular involvement whatsoever. And so often in, you know, in working with applicants, we have to hash that out a bit and ask, you know, what were you involved in college? What have you been involved in, you know, in your professional life? And usually applicants have things that they do, but for many different reasons, they don't think it's important to include on the resume. But as Emma said, you know, when an admissions officer is reviewing your resume, almost like how, you know, a software might look at it, but again, with the human element, we are looking for, you know, things that are going to be important to us, you know, for our program. And I just think that it's really helpful and can actually help you connect with your reader if you include your extracurricular involvements and even your hobbies. So you never know if, you know, you put, you know, avid F1 fan, you know, at the bottom of the resume, the person who's reading it also loves F1, and that, you know, really sticks with them in the process. You have no way of knowing what might resonate. And so you can add some value by adding some personality, you know, through your extracurriculars.
Right, but then owning it, because if you talk about being a wine enthusiast and you don't know your Bordeaux from your Beaujolais, things might be hollow. I'm just staying on that. I know that we're going to be breaking down some of the different sections, but you talk about extracurriculars, Brittany. With all of the applications that you saw coming into Wharton, were you able to sort of identify, you know what, it looks like the individual's only really taken on this particular engagement in the last 2 months before they applied to school, or that they have such a laundry list, you know, all the way through college, and sometimes it's almost overwhelming and perhaps lacks depth and substance because they've, you know, taken those extracurriculars in so many different directions.
Yeah, I think there are very few people who do many things well. But there are some applicants who really, you know, can juggle, you know, working 60 hours a week and doing, you know, 3 or 4 different extracurriculars and, you know, 2, you know, CrossFit classes a week. And that's great for those people. But I more often see applicants who know the value of community engagement, you know, leadership outside of work, and who don't have it and try to sort of tack it on at the end of the process. And that's a tough call because it's something that we know admissions officers are looking for. I think that, you know, in my work with applicants, I try to get them to brainstorm a little bit more, maybe about the less formal ways that they've been engaging, whether it's in service or in other hobbies, maybe even just informal mentorship at work that might present as just a lot more authentic and a longer term commitment. So I think that you need to get creative sometimes and maybe just think differently about some of your engagements. And often that's better than just, you know, signing up for something last minute and being, you know, not really too engaged in it.
Right. Heidi, this idea of, you know, having different sort of interests, but, you know, there can be different professional projects too. You sort of look at that as a potential sort of starting point or an icebreaker, maybe in an interview.
Yeah, the resume is, you know, an important part of the application for the admissions committee for sure. But then when you do get to interview stage, it becomes also really important in the interview process. Most of the schools, or many of the schools, will use alumni or current students to interview. And in many cases, they will only get your resume. So that's the only thing that they know about you. That's the only thing that they have to go on. So it is, again, it's telling a story to the person, not only in the admissions committee, but also to who's going to be interviewing you. And that will be kind of the jumping off point for many questions, digging a bit deeper into, you know, the different projects you've done, the reasons behind why you've made certain career choices. And so it becomes very important when you do get to interview stage, that the resume.
Right, so we've sort of created a few before and after examples, and Heidi, I'll stay with you to sort of take us through the first one. So what do we have here? And by the way, as you speak, it's the hottest day of the year. Spring is finally here. I'm going to close this blind so that Haley doesn't say to me, "You're sitting in the dark," but hopefully before my laptop.
Here we have, we wanted to kind of give some concrete examples of what a resume, you know, what to do with a resume. And so we started with kind of a sample resume, which is pretty generic, and we'll be looking through a few kind of before and afters. So maybe we can just go to the next section, we have 7 tips that we're going to get through today.
I do that right? Let's see.
Yeah, there we go. So the first thing is that they'll be looking, a lot of what the icons will be looking for is career progression. And there's a few ways to show this. Here you can see that the applicant has just kind of listed their company and their title. And if you kind of do the next one, what you really want to see is to be able to break that out. So to show career progression here, you can really see how by breaking it into the 2 different roles that you've had and the time frame, and then even you can even include some bullet points. So maybe that you were promoted, maybe ahead of schedule, or why you were promoted. Anything that you could be drawn out about that promotion that shows that you actually have, you know, performed well against your peers, and also any kind of management roles that you might have had.
And Emma, just on this point and the way that Heidi's taken this example to break it down, help me just to be able to see those different roles, because I mean, you're not spending hours and hours on each resume. That this is, you're experts at it, but still it's a limited amount of time to be able to gather that information.
Absolutely. So you want to make sure that your layout is as clear as possible, so that you're not making the person who's reading your CV or your resume work too hard to find the information. So it's very important that you do have it laid out in an easy to access manner. So yeah, that's really crucial.
And of course, not trying to overfill that resume by using an 8-sized font, and it just becomes overwhelming. So Heidi, what have we got here? This is we're cutting things out. This is too much detail?
Yes. So there are certain things that you can cut. Again, this isn't a job resume, so you don't need to, especially there's a bit of a caveat here. I think in certain industries, certainly consulting, banking, some of the tech companies, you really don't want to spend a lot of real estate on your resume talking about your job description. They'll be familiar with that. So they'll know what an analyst, an associate, and a consultant does on a daily basis. So you really want to focus your resume on what you do better than someone else with the same title, not explaining what your title means. There will be a part in the application form usually to talk about you know, what your job responsibilities are. So this is a great place if you need space that you can make some cuts.
And just to give them a sense, perhaps, Brittany, you know, Big Four, MBB, investment bankers, maybe private equity, associates, software engineers, you know, these are perhaps some of those traditional feeders where you did acquire, you know, great knowledge of the sort of activities, roles, and functions that these applicants.
Absolutely. I think it's important, though, to err on the side of understanding that most admissions officers, have read, resumes before from applicants that are coming from the backgrounds that are going to be the bigger pools. So when you are thinking about the resume and that has to be one page, you need to be just really careful about what you decide to put on it. And just, general role descriptions are one of the first things that will cut in favor of details that speak to the actual impact you've had and your very specific role.
Right, as Heidi said, it's valuable real estate. And I guess this goes to your next slide, Heidi, just in terms of focusing on results and the value that they have.
Yes, and this goes back to kind of, what we were talking about with the job description. Something here, for example, doing a cost analysis as a consultant is really something that's expected of you in your job. And that it's hard to tell from this if, is this anything beyond just what your job is? What they want to see is, how did you do your job better? How did you have impact? They want to be able to see that you have that you've made some kind of impact on the company, on your client. So really performing a cost analysis for companies is nothing exciting here, but here where you talk about the actual impact that you had, the type of company that you were working with. So is it big, is it small? Again, I have no context in the before here, but in the after I understand, okay, you're working for a big company, exactly the impact, there's a bottom line impact here, and also not just for the company, but for you, your firm. So really trying to demonstrate that you understand what is important in an engagement, not just that you perform your duties well, but that you actually understand what the impact can be, and it can also kind of help to make the case for transitioning to more of a management role post MBA.
Got it. I suppose the other side of that caveat, Heidi, that they know that consultants performing cost analysis, you expect to see that as part of the roles and responsibilities. What if you're in a startup or just a company that may not be familiar to the admissions office? How much time, when you're already short on space, how much time can you then take to frame what your company does?
It's really tricky, and it's important, I think, in the resume. So there's a place, when you mention your company, the name of the company, often if it's not a well-known company, something, especially a startup, one line that kind of is a description of what the company is, who its clients are, where it is in the market, how many employees it has, any kind of context that can help the reader really understand, kind of place the company in the in the world, really. So is it a startup? Is it a mid-level company? Who are its clients? It is tricky. It's not a lot. You don't have a lot of space to do that, and so you really have to think very carefully about how to do it. But it is, if it's not a well-known company or your role is not well-known, you do need to provide some of that context probably here.
Right, and irrespective of the company that it might be or the context of your work, Emma, you place this emphasis on some hard numbers to be able to actually measure your results. So, well, quantifying.
Yeah, absolutely. And as the top tip here says, quantify, quantify, quantify. And the idea here is that if you look at the example, the before example, completed interviews with senior and mid managements of major corporations, etc. The idea is that you want to give, to show how you contributed. And one of the best ways to do that is to actually use numbers. So things that show the scope of the work that you've done, the size of your clients, anything that you can to make sort of more detail. So here, for example, if it says completed interviews, well, how many interviews were you doing? Was it 1? Was it 2? And then you see over 200, and all of a sudden it's giving much more indication of scale to the person that's reading your resume. If you're working on a multi-million-dollar project, for example, well, how much was it actually worth? So quantify it. The second bullet there, project managing a cybersecurity benchmarking project worth sort of circa 400K a year, and it gives much better idea to the person reading your CV. Things like budget amounts, the number of people involved, the dollar value to the firm of your client, and all of these things will make your CV stand out, bearing in mind, of course, that again, yours is just one of perhaps 100 that they're looking at, and it just helps give that indication to the person straight up. And then one of the other points that's worth mentioning is that sort of scope and descriptive numbers give this sort of visual impression of analytical ability. And this is so true. If you dot a few numbers around your resume, you're going to give the impression of analytical weight, even if it's, you know, in a role that perhaps that's not normally something that you do on a daily basis.
We always talk at The Economist or the BBC of having that sort of data hook from which you can tell a story. And storytelling, you know, the CV might be riddled with bullet points, but even within those bullet points, that can create a narrative and how you might emphasize, you know, certain aspects of your contribution.
Absolutely. And the thing to remember is that when you are creating a resume, it is designed to make you stand out from your peer group. There will be other people with your profile who are applying to the same school, to the same MBA class that you are, and you need to make yours look more impressive. So one of the ways to do that is avoiding sort of general statements. Be as specific as you can, and that will enable you to stand out amongst your peers. And one of the things that I sort of quite regularly recommend to my clients is to use a subheader of selected projects. Can be really useful for deals, for different projects that you've been involved in. And it's sort of the idea of doing that is it helps stop the amount of material become overwhelming for the reader, allows you to sort of cherry pick those specific projects or deals that are particularly memorable. Perhaps they're bigger name clients. You want to bring them to the attention of the person that's reviewing your file. And it also shows the reader that you're taking a conscious decision not to include everything. There might be other very valuable material, but these are the things that you want to highlight and that you believe are going to sort of have the most impact in terms of adding weight to your resume and making you stand out against the rest of the class.
Now, we've talked earlier, Emma, about, you know, each of these components and how they plug together. So if I take your example of, you know, helping clients make evidence-based decisions, a bit woolly, I'm really not sure what sort of impact that has had. And now I learn from this revised bullet point that not only that the client that it was for, but this is 600 branch offices, you know, sort of 80% impact. Are we then trying to set the scene for a recommender who might be, you know, then taking one of these bullet points and adding further depth and color to it?
Yeah, that's certainly one thing that can be done. I mean, sometimes I'm not sure whether to recommend to clients whether they sort of expand on what's on their CV. If it's a really major deal or project that they've been working on, then yes, that's often something that they will want to expand in the recommendation, and then they can say to the recommender, look, it's referenced in my resume. I would like to go through it in more detail in my recommendation. Sometimes it's nice to have some things on your CV and then some different examples on your recommendation, because quite often I have discussions with clients and they'll say, for example, with the LBS application, there's a section which asks about your kind of job responsibilities, but that's more the day-to-day thing that we're trying to avoid on the resume. But if it's information there about sort of major clients and major deals, it's on the CV and then it's on the recommendation. And they're saying, well, I feel like I'm repeating too much information and it's here and it's here and it's here. So it's a good idea sometimes to spread those things out so that there's not too much repetition across the sort of entire application.
Right. So Brittany, a resume that perhaps begins with, you know, I'm great. You know, my people skills are off the charts. Maybe some big statements that someone might make. You frame this in terms of, you know, showing rather than telling and, you know, listing what you think you're so great at. How does this work and add the sort of depth and insight that's going to be valuable to an admissions committee?
So we've talked about this concept a lot. We talk about it in terms of, you know, letters of recommendation, essays, and again, even the resume, to show and not just tell. And so really what that means is, you know, use examples, use details, whether it's quantifiable, a project-based example. Your reader has no way of knowing if what you say is true or not, if you are just saying, I am this, or I know this, or I do this. You need to root it in an example from your work. And this goes, again, beyond the resume. So it's really important to, when you're crafting your resume, to go through just line by line and ask yourself that, you know, am I backing up this statement? Because admissions officers, you know, will do that as well when they're reading the resume.
I think all three of you can add great panelists to your own resumes, because the more questions we get, it's typically because the content has been so good and people keep pushing out their questions. Now, I think we have one more aspect of the resume that we wanted to look at, and then I'm going to just grab 3 or 4 of the questions that people have asked. But this is the additional sections. Now, how does this work, Brittany?
Yeah, so this is where often readers will look first at your education, just to get a sense of, you know, where your story is starting, and then work their way, you know, through your career. So it's, again, you know, really important to just not be, you know, generic here, but also to not forget that you can include sort of key differentiators regarding your candidacy through these sections. These are the sections that can show your, you know, community involvement, your leadership, your extracurriculars. It can demonstrate what's important to you, and it might even provide those little value adds, kind of sound bits, right, to admissions officers about where you might find your place on campus. I feel like I get to know a candidate the most, or at least the most personally, in this section. So, you know, when I work with candidates on, you know, developing their resume, we really try to make sure we build these sections out, but with information that's going to add value to the admissions committee. So we don't need to know about usually like programming languages, or that you know social media or Excel, Microsoft Suite, like things like that. I actually would encourage applicants to get, you know, creative here too, if they can, and to really try to think outside of the box. I've never remembered an application by a GMAT score, or even just where you went to college. There's tons of, you know, impressive and amazing institutions, you know, in the US, abroad, you know, everywhere. But what might stand out to me most is, you know, something that you've done extracurricularly or outside of work. So it's just really important to remember that this is a holistic process. It's not all about, you know, your achievements. It is, of course, about impact, skills, knowledge, but you should, you know, feel comfortable talking about, you know, the other important aspects of you too.
Right. Heidi, I've, you know, hosted many of those centre court panels with the admissions directors from the top schools, you know, Chad from HBS, Blair from Wharton. With Kirsten, for example, I talk about how the detective work that they might do and looking for patterns of behaviour. And she already very firmly but very politely corrects me. She says, no, Matt, it's just behaviours. And as I look at some of the examples that we've given here, you know, for example, whether it's the fraternity or the science club, this idea of impact, roles that you've played and what that might have led to. And this is ultimately, you know, fitting into a much wider picture and a story that you're telling. Impact in that club, impact in your work, impact, maybe you know, raised funds for cancer research through running a marathon. I mean, they love to be able to join these dots, don't they?
They do. And again, it just gets back to kind of understanding the context. So if you're just talking about you know, being a member of a club versus having a leadership role, or running a conference, or putting on an event that that actually had, you know, a certain number of participants, it really helps them to get a feeling for how involved you were. The other thing is, you know, things like, you know, everybody lists travel. So what does that mean to you? Like, what does travel mean? How many countries? What kind of travel? What do you like to do when you travel? You know, like, how many cuisines have you tasted in different formats? You know, it's kind of giving that flavor that really helps them to understand a bit more about you, and about your personality. I also love how Kirsten often talks about one of the first things she goes to is the transcripts, just to see the types of classes that you've taken, and you know, where that curiosity comes from. So again, this is another area in the resume to show your curiosity, your involvement, your leadership, your thirst for knowledge. All of these things can come out here like in a very little space.
Right. Now, I'm just going to take perhaps 2 or 3 great questions that we've had, and then we'll move to the final slides of today's session. Brittany, you had talked about maybe recommenders that were just too exuberant, and one of our viewers has asked, can you equally overly embellish your resume with the details? Is that something that you'd ever pick up on when you were working in admissions at Wharton?
So you can, I think, embellish. And I saw there's a similar question in the chat about do schools verify the lines of your resume? So they are not going to verify the information on your resume line by line, but you 100% need to be completely honest and not exaggerate your resume. And the reason is that your resume is going to be used in other parts of the application process. The interview, for example, if you are in an interview situation where your interviewer is interviewing you based on your resume and you cannot answer questions or your answers do not align with the things that you've outlined on your resume, you're in trouble, because that is a huge red flag. So, and it speaks to, it will color the other aspects of what could have been a really strong application, because authenticity really matters. Honesty and integrity, matter in this process. So, yeah, you should not feel the need to embellish the resume, because it's just not going to be worth it in the end. It can impact too many other parts of the process.
Yeah, if it comes back to bite you, there's no way back from that one. Emma, I suppose the resume within other parts of the application, we have clients that have won awards, they've published, they have patents to their name, all sorts of fantastic stuff. Should we be filling all of these in the resume, but also remembering, the other online application forms we're going to finish today's webinar with, where schools will specifically ask for awards and other different achievements.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think it goes back a little bit to that idea of repetition that was sort of talking about earlier on, and making sure that there isn't, you want to make sure that different parts of your application showcase different things. I think most people would want to put scholarships, for examples, that they've received, especially in their undergraduate, within their sort of education section. But it is, if you have a lot, then it's a case of cherry picking what is likely to be sort of most impactful with the committee. But certainly a lot of schools, as you say, do offer that opportunity within the application form to put any sort of awards or scholarships that have been received.
Got it. So Brittany gave the example, we don't need Excel and therefore probably not Bloomberg terminals on the resume. Think about what you're really trying to emphasize. And I think Heidi also covered this idea that leadership positions in college, even if it goes back 3, 4, 5 years, how this helps the schools to identify behaviors, engagement, commitment. Brittany talked earlier about it's not just performance in the classroom, but the schools are really thinking about what you'll contribute to the community outside of the classroom. So we're going to move on to the final section, and thank you for everyone staying with us, and thank you to the panelists for the additional time. I know that we've gone a little bit long, but now we're going to move to this area of the online application, which I guess, Emma, we've already touched upon. Does it matter, or just quickly fill in the autofill on this one? Surely there must be some shortcuts.
No shortcuts. This is one of the things that used to drive me crazy, was you'd read a really polished application with great essays and strong recommendations and a nice resume, and you get to the application form and there'd be typos and errors, and you could tell that someone had been sort of running against the clock to submit their application, and they'd come to it last minute and then gone, crikey, because certainly for the LBS application, there are a lot of what we would call mini essays within that application form. So yes, the short answer is it does matter, and it's something that you should spend time over. It should look as polished as the rest of your application, and certainly not something that you can leave last minute. You don't want to appear sloppy, you don't want to appear lazy, and you want to show that you've given that as much effort as the rest of your materials. I think one thing it's worth noting is that there is also a big variety of material that's required in application forms. So some schools just have quite a number of perhaps drop-down boxes where you can do it in quite a short period of time, and you just select your function and everything. But then other schools do have, especially European schools, tend to require quite a lot of additional information within that application form. So whether it's mini essays, whether it's sort of free text drop-down boxes, and all of that can require quite a lot of time. So I would say certainly make sure that you don't leave that until the very last minute.
Right. I mean, Brittany, Wharton is in a typical year receiving close to 7,000 applications. It will be interesting to see what that number is for 2020, 2021. So, if you're asking these questions or providing the opportunity for an applicant to share these additional details on the online application, I mean, it's because it matters to the school, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've often found that the app data is a missed opportunity for a lot of candidates. It's an opportunity to double down on the story, possibly, that you've told in other components, whether through your resume, your essays, your letters of recommendation, or it could tell a part of your story that you didn't have an opportunity to tell through those other components. So I often suggest starting the app data immediately when the applications open, because some schools, not Penn normally, but some other schools have some not only dynamic questions, so questions that can pop up as you get further into the app, depending on program choice, things like that. But also just even within the employment sections for some schools, you basically have almost mini essays or short answers that you can be completing. So you should really be filling out the data and looking at what information you're able to share in the other components and using the app data to scaffold that or to fill in any gaps. And so this just all goes back, to the point that every part of this process really matters and helps paint this really comprehensive picture of who you are and the type of applicant that you are. So I really like using the app data as a nice way to just fill gaps, double down on a story, or get information in there that we really can't fit in elsewhere.
And Heidi, any sort of do's and don'ts for this section from your perspective?
Yeah, there are quite a few, I would say. One is to make sure that whatever you put in the application form, in the data form, coincides with what you have elsewhere. So whether that's on your resume, on your LinkedIn profile, even if you've mentioned something in your essays, those are things like titles, dates, the name of the company, the name of the extracurricular activity. People sometimes will swap different names and it causes a lot of confusion. So just make sure that everything coincides. That's one thing. One other thing, I mean, it is tempting in the application form to repeat what's on your resume sometimes, just kind of cut and paste. And I think that that's a real missed opportunity. I think again, this is an opportunity to kind of elaborate a bit more, to add information, to maybe add a bit of color if it's not there. Certain things, obviously, your title or something, you can't do that. But when they ask about what your job description is, or your most significant accomplishment, or your most significant challenge, I would encourage people not to repeat information, to maybe go into a little bit more depth there. There's another thing that some people get really hooked up on are the drop downs. Often those don't exactly coincide with your industry or your title or their post MBA job. Maybe it's not exactly, should I choose this or this? I think that one rule of thumb that I would say is if there are parts of the application, and this goes for also things like salaries and bonuses, and do I include this, do I not, how do I explain this? If the space is not there, if the drop down is not, doesn't allow you to write something in, choose the best and most reasonable option. It's really, as long as you can, if you had to at some point defend it for why you chose that, then that's fine. Don't worry too much about not fitting into all the right boxes. And then the other thing I would say that's really important is to be accurate. So we did talk a little bit about the resume, if they're going to check it. I do think that, in the application form, they ask for things like salary, titles, dates. Most schools now will do background checks on admitted applicants. And that's kind of, they could be checking everything, they could be checking nothing, but you don't want anything that's on there to be inaccurate, because that will put you in a position to have to really stress about it once you get accepted, like, oh my God, my salary wasn't exactly right. Are they going to check? And you just never know. So just always err on the side of caution, assume that they will check, and make sure that it's accurate.
Right. And presumably, although, Emma, you didn't have the time to look at everybody's social media profiles, it's just that there is this option. You could quickly match resume and the details in the application form with a very public LinkedIn profile, just to get a sense of, is this the same person, and the sort of path and achievements that they have to the name.
Definitely, and we recommend strongly doing a social media audit sort of when you submit your application, just to make sure that you have got everything aligned. And just with normal life now, it's one of the first places you go to if you're looking to sort of find out a bit more about somebody, or understand a bit more about their professional background. You do jump onto LinkedIn and just see where they worked, who their contacts are, perhaps where they went to university, and if that information is not aligned with what you've sort of supplied to the school as part of your application, then yeah, you're in trouble. So definitely worth reviewing that.
Right. And if there's a question, I'm going to take the one final question from our viewers, how you can reach out to schools, or how you can make sure that they just have that information. So one of the viewers has asked Brittany that they had a name change due to naturalization since undergrad, and how they should reflect that in the application portal. And maybe if some other situation it's not clear, they can reach out to the school and just confirm how to best. But I'm sure you've seen lots of those other situations. How best to handle them?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways. I mean, number one, you can always reach out to the school with something like that. That's a legitimate thing to be communicating that won't be, annoying on the admissions end. But many schools in their apps, you actually have a section underneath name where it might say other, or other names used. So sometimes there's a specific question, and you always have, not always, but in many cases, the additional information section to just make a little note about that. I usually put other things in that section if I'm going to use it. So I think that if there's not a space on the actual app data underneath a drop down or explanation for name or previous name, that it's something you can definitely call or email admissions about.
And just to be clear, with all of those Marvel superheroes that Emma knows so well, this is not the place to be clever and put Iron Man or some other pet name, nickname, or just how you'd like to be perceived in public. It's right. Well, I cannot believe just how much the three of you have covered in the last 75 minutes. So we tried to handle questions as we go, but as I said earlier, we have this extraordinary expert team. So as you've no doubt got a sense in the last hour and 15 minutes, the level of insider insight that they bring to their work at Fortuna. We're mindful, and certainly your questions reflected this, your very distinct and unique stories. And we'd love to connect with you to be able to look at all the questions that we didn't get the time to cover as you consider recommenders, who to ask, how might you work with those recommenders. Certainly, we always take the time to review a resume. People are often saying, oh, thank you for reading through the resume before we talked about my business school plans. Well, that just seems second nature if that call is going to have real value and be able to share these sort of insights with you. So do contact us on the Fortuna website for a free consultation. And we hope that you can join us next Tuesday. As I mentioned last week, the Masterclass was all about sort of strategic positioning, introspection, self-reflection, and getting started in this process. You've just stayed with us to think far more deeply about letters of recommendation and the resume. So next Tuesday, it's time to start thinking about the essays, that next point in the process. So that's at noon Eastern on May 4th, and you can register on the Fortuna website. It just remains for me to thank Heidi, to thank Emma, and to thank Brittany for all that you've put together to share. I mean, boom, you covered so much in 80 minutes, but there was a lot of thinking in what you wanted to cover for the viewers to get the most out. So from me, and I think on behalf of the viewers, thank you for a fantastic session.
Thank you very much.